The sun had barely begun to rise over Hawaii when the world for thousands of American servicemen changed forever. The morning air over the island of Oahu was calm, warm, and quiet. Palm trees barely moved in the gentle breeze drifting in from the Pacific Ocean. For most of the soldiers stationed across the island, it was supposed to be another ordinary Sunday morning. At Wheeler Field, one of the main fighter bases protecting Pearl Harbor, many pilots were still asleep after a long night at the officers' club. Among them were two young men who had no idea they were about to become part of one of the most extraordinary air battles in American history. Second Lieutenant George Welch was only 23 years old. He had graduated from flight school not long before and had never fired his weapons in real combat. Like most young fighter pilots stationed in Hawaii, he spent his time training, flying practice patrols, and enjoying the relaxed island life whenever he could. His closest friend on the base was another young pilot, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor. The two men were nearly inseparable. They trained together, flew together, and spent most of their free time together. The night before had been no different. On the evening before the attack, the officers' club at Wheeler Field hosted a dinner dance. Music filled the building as officers and their dates danced late into the night. After the dance ended, Welch and Taylor stayed behind with a few other pilots for an all-night poker game. Cards, cigarettes, laughter, and the occasional argument over chips kept them awake until the early hours of the morning. Neither man had slept. By dawn, Welch was still sitting in a chair at the club, wearing the same tuxedo trousers from the night before. Then suddenly the sound came. At first it was distant. A low rumble in the sky. Then it grew louder. Much louder. Outside the windows, the peaceful Hawaiian morning exploded into chaos. Aircraft engines roared overhead. Moments later, explosions shook the ground. Black smoke began rising over Pearl Harbor. At first many Americans believed it was some kind of drill. Training exercises were common, and no one imagined that the United States could be under attack. But this was no exercise. Far out in the Pacific Ocean, nearly 200 miles north of Oahu, a massive Japanese carrier fleet had launched one of the most carefully planned military operations in modern history. 6 aircraft carriers had sent hundreds of aircraft toward Hawaii. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighter escorts. More than 300 aircraft in total. Their mission was simple: destroy the United States Pacific Fleet before it could interfere with Japan's expansion across Asia. The first wave of aircraft reached Oahu just before 8 in the morning. They arrived silently out of the rising sun. Within seconds, bombs began falling across the island. At Pearl Harbor, torpedo bombers flew low over the water and released their deadly weapons into the line of American battleships anchored in the harbor. Explosions tore through steel hulls. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. On board the battleship USS Arizona, an armor-piercing bomb plunged through the deck and detonated the ship's forward ammunition magazine. The explosion destroyed the entire front half of the ship. More than 1,000 sailors died in a single instant. Across the harbor, other ships burned. Men jumped into the oil-covered water to escape the flames. Above them, Japanese aircraft screamed through the sky. Machine guns rattled. Bombs whistled downward. The attack was precise, brutal, and overwhelming. Meanwhile, at Wheeler Field, the situation was just as disastrous. American fighter aircraft had been parked wingtip to wingtip along the airfield. The arrangement was meant to prevent sabotage, but it created the perfect target for enemy aircraft. Japanese fighters and dive bombers swept across the base. Machine gun fire ripped through rows of parked aircraft. Fuel tanks exploded. Ammunition ignited in violent blasts. Within minutes, dozens of American fighters were burning wrecks. Pilots ran toward their planes only to watch them explode before they could reach them. Some were cut down by strafing fighters. Others died in the flames. In the first minutes of the attack, the United States lost more aircraft than in many entire battles. Yet in the middle of this devastation, 2 exhausted young pilots were about to make a decision that would change everything. Inside the officers' club, George Welch rushed toward the nearest telephone. He had just remembered something. Not all of their aircraft were at Wheeler Field. Recently, Several fighters from their squadron had been moved to a small auxiliary airstrip on the northern side of the island. The airstrip was called Haleiwa Field. It was little more than a dirt runway used for training and gunnery practice. But if the Japanese had not discovered it yet, those aircraft might still be intact. Welch grabbed the phone and called the field. When someone answered, he shouted into the receiver, "Fuel 2 P-40s. Arm them. We're coming." He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask for orders. He simply hung up. Meanwhile, Kenneth Taylor was already running outside toward his car. It was a brand new Buick he had purchased not long before. Welch jumped into the passenger seat. Still wearing their tuxedo trousers from the night before, the two pilots raced away from Wheeler Field. Behind them, the base continued to burn. As they sped down the highway, Japanese aircraft roared overhead. Fighter planes strafed roads and buildings across the island. Bullets tore into the pavement nearby as Taylor pushed the car faster. The road ahead curved along the northern coastline of Oahu. 10 miles away, Haleiwa Field waited. If the Japanese had overlooked it, there might still be aircraft there. If not, the battle for the skies over Hawaii was already lost. The Buick's engine roared as Taylor pushed the car past 100 miles per hour. The two young pilots barely spoke. They both understood what they were about to do. They had no orders, no briefing, no idea how many enemy aircraft were in the sky. But they also knew something else. If no one fought back, the attack would destroy every aircraft on the island. And once that happened, nothing would stop the Japanese from completely controlling the skies over Pearl Harbor. Several minutes later, the car slid to a stop beside the rough grass runway at Oahu. To their astonishment, the airfield was still untouched. No bomb craters. No burning aircraft. Just two fighter planes sitting on the edge of the field. Both of them were Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. The ground crew had already prepared them. Their engines were running. Fuel tanks were full. But there had been very little time. Only the wing-mounted machine guns had been loaded. The heavier nose-mounted weapons were still empty. Each aircraft carried only a limited amount of ammunition. Against hundreds of enemy aircraft, it would barely matter. Still, Welch didn't hesitate. He climbed onto the wing of the nearest fighter and dropped into the cockpit. The P-40 was not the most advanced fighter aircraft of the war. Compared to the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0, it was slower and less maneuverable. The Zero could climb faster and turn tighter in a dogfight. But the P-40 had its own advantages. It was heavier, stronger, and far more durable. Its powerful engine allowed it to dive faster than almost any aircraft in the sky. If used correctly, that speed could become a deadly weapon. But there was one problem. No American pilot had ever fought a Zero before. No one knew exactly what the enemy aircraft could do. Everything Welch and Taylor were about to learn would happen in combat. And they would learn it within minutes. Welch strapped himself into the cockpit. Ahead of him, the rough dirt runway stretched toward the open ocean. Behind him, Taylor's aircraft rolled into position. The engine thundered as Welch pushed the throttle forward. The P-40 began to move. The aircraft bounced across the uneven ground. The tail lifted. The speed climbed. Then the wheels left the earth. For the first time during the attack on Pearl Harbor, an American fighter aircraft was finally airborne. And George Welch was heading straight toward the battle. The moment George Welch's P-40 Warhawk lifted off the rough grass runway at Haleiwa Field, the situation over Oahu was already catastrophic. Smoke covered the horizon in every direction. From the cockpit, Welch could see thick black columns rising from Pearl Harbor, from Hickam Field, and from several other military installations across the island. The entire southern coastline of Oahu looked like it was on fire. Japanese aircraft still filled the sky. Dive bombers circled above airfields, preparing for new attack runs. Fighter escorts swept low across the landscape, strafing roads, buildings, and anything that moved. For the Japanese pilots, the mission was going exactly as planned. American aircraft were supposed to be destroyed on the ground before they could ever reach the sky. Most of them already had been. But the Japanese had overlooked one small airstrip on the northern coast. And now 2 American fighters were climbing into the battle. Behind Welch, Kenneth Taylor's P-40 roared into the air as well, its propellers slicing through the morning sky as it gained altitude. Neither pilot had received orders. Neither had been briefed on enemy tactics. They were flying directly into a battle they barely understood. But the decision had already been made. They were going to fight. Welch turned his aircraft toward the southern side of the island where the attack was heaviest. As he climbed higher, the scale of the devastation became clearer. Oil slicks burned across the waters of Pearl Harbor. Battleships were sinking at their moorings. Fires raged across multiple airfields. Above the smoke, Japanese aircraft moved in organized formations, completing their bombing runs before turning back toward the ocean. Welch scanned the sky carefully. He knew the biggest threat would not be the bombers. It would be the fighters escorting them. The Japanese Zero was already gaining a reputation among Allied pilots in Asia for being incredibly maneuverable and deadly in a dogfight. If one of those fighters got behind him, the fight could be over in seconds. But Welch also knew something else. His P-40 had one advantage: speed in a dive. If he could strike quickly and escape before the fighters reacted, he might have a chance. Minutes later, he spotted his first target. Below him, a formation of Japanese dive bombers was attacking Ava Marine Corps Air Station on the southwestern side of Oahu. The aircraft were Aichi D-3A dive bombers, known later to American pilots as VALs. The bombers had already dropped their payloads and were now flying low over the airfield, strafing the ground with machine gun fire. They believed the skies above them were clear. They were wrong. Welch pushed the control stick forward. His P-40 tipped into a steep dive. The aircraft accelerated rapidly as gravity pulled it downward toward the enemy formation. The airspeed indicator climbed quickly. 200 miles per hour. 250. 300. The wind screamed past the canopy. Below him, the Japanese bombers grew larger in his gun sight. The rear gunner in one of the bombers scanned the sky behind them, searching for threats. But Welch was diving out of the sun. The glare made it almost impossible to see him. By the time the gunner noticed the approaching fighter, it was already too late. Welch squeezed the trigger. 4 wing-mounted machine guns erupted at once. Streams of tracer rounds tore through the morning sky and slammed into the Japanese bomber. Bullets ripped through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. Smoke burst from the engine cowling. The bomber lurched violently in the air. Welch kept firing for another moment before pulling back on the stick. The damaged aircraft pitched forward and spiraled downward toward the ocean. Welch did not have time to confirm the destruction. He was already climbing away from the formation. Behind him, the remaining Japanese bombers scattered in every direction. It had taken only seconds. But the shock among the Japanese pilots was enormous. American fighters were not supposed to be in the air. Yet somehow one had just appeared and attacked their formation. Meanwhile, Kenneth Taylor had followed Welch into the dive. He selected his own target and fired a burst at another dive bomber attempting to circle back for another strafing run. His bullet struck the aircraft near the wing root. Fuel ignited instantly. The bomber exploded in midair, scattering burning debris across the sky. 2 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed within moments. For the first time that morning, the attackers were taking losses. But the celebration lasted only seconds. Above them, 2 Japanese fighters suddenly turned toward the American aircraft. Zeros. The escort pilots had spotted the attack. Now they were diving toward the P-40s with deadly speed. Welch saw them immediately. The sleek Japanese fighters were faster in a climb and far more agile in tight turns. If they forced him into a traditional dogfight, he would almost certainly lose. He remembered the one advantage he had: the dive. Welch rolled his aircraft upside down and pushed the nose downward. The horizon spun violently as the P-40 dropped into a near-vertical plunge. The aircraft accelerated rapidly. The Zero pilots tried to follow. But their lightweight airframes were not designed for such extreme speeds. If they dove too steeply, their wings could tear apart. Reluctantly, they pulled out of the dive and circled above. Welch continued descending until the ocean filled his entire windshield. At the last moment, he pulled back on the stick. The aircraft leveled out just above the water. The G-forces pressed him hard into his seat. The engine roared as the fighter raced forward only a few hundred feet above the waves. The Japanese fighters were still far above him now. He had escaped the trap. But the battle was far from over. Ahead of him, Welch spotted another opportunity. Several Japanese bombers were heading back toward the ocean, likely returning to their carriers after completing their attack runs. Their fuel and ammunition were limited. They believed the skies were still mostly safe. Welch pushed the throttle forward. The P-40 surged ahead. He closed the distance quickly and moved into firing range behind the last bomber in the formation. The rear gunner fired desperately, tracer rounds flashing past the cockpit. Welch held steady. Then he fired. The machine guns hammered again. Bullets ripped through the bomber's tail section. Control cables snapped. The aircraft rolled violently and plunged toward the ocean below. 3 enemy aircraft had now been destroyed. And it was not even 9 o'clock in the morning. But Welch knew the fight could not continue much longer. Each of his machine guns carried only a limited amount of ammunition. At the rate he was firing, he had only seconds of trigger time remaining. Kenneth Taylor was in the same situation. Both pilots had nearly emptied their weapons. They needed to return to Haleiwa Field. Welch turned north. The 2 P-40 fighters raced back across the island. The flight took less than 10 minutes. When they landed, ground crews rushed toward the aircraft. Mechanics immediately began reloading ammunition belts and refueling the fighters. Welch climbed out of the cockpit and quickly inspected his aircraft. Only then did he notice the damage. 3 bullet holes pierced the fuselage. A Japanese gunner had managed to hit him during one of the attack runs. The bullets had passed through the metal skin without striking anything critical. He had not even noticed during the fight. Nearby, Kenneth Taylor was climbing out of his own aircraft. Moments later, a crew chief ran toward them with alarming news. Another wave of Japanese aircraft was approaching the island. The attack was not over. More bombers. More fighters. More destruction. Welch and Taylor looked at each other. Neither man said a word. They already knew what they were going to do. Within minutes, both pilots were climbing back into their cockpits. Engines roared once again as the P-40s prepared to take off. The second wave of Japanese aircraft was already approaching Oahu, and the 2 American pilots were about to fly directly into it. The engines of the 2 P-40 Warhawks thundered once again as George Welch and Kenneth Taylor pushed their fighters down the rough grass strip at Haleiwa Field. They had only been on the ground for a few minutes. Just enough time to reload ammunition and refuel the aircraft. Now the second wave of the Japanese attack force was already approaching the island. Mechanics barely had time to step away as Welch's fighter lifted off the runway once more. Taylor followed seconds later. The 2 aircraft climbed quickly toward the southern side of Oahu, where the smoke from the earlier attacks still covered the sky. This time, however, they were not alone. Across the island, a handful of other American pilots had managed to get aircraft into the air. Some were flying older P-36 fighters, machines that were already considered outdated by the start of the war. Others had barely escaped destruction at their bases and were flying damaged aircraft. In total, fewer than a dozen American fighters were now airborne over the entire island. Against them were more than 100 incoming Japanese aircraft. As Welch climbed higher, the battlefield came into view once again. The island looked even worse than before. Fires still burned across Wheeler Field. At Pearl Harbor, thick smoke covered the harbor like a dark cloud. Ships continued to burn where they had been struck earlier. But above the destruction, the sky was filling with aircraft once again. The second wave had arrived. Japanese bombers and fighters poured across the southern coast of Oahu in tight formations. Their mission was to finish what the first wave had started. Destroy any remaining American aircraft. Cripple the airfields. Ensure that no organized defense could form. Welch spotted them almost immediately. Dozens of aircraft were approaching Wheeler Field. Fighter escorts circled above them like guards protecting the bombers below. The odds were overwhelming. But Welch didn't hesitate. He pushed his aircraft into a dive. The P-40 dropped through the sky toward the enemy formation. The sudden movement caught the attention of several Japanese pilots. Zeros began turning toward the diving American fighter. But Welch was already moving too fast. His aircraft slammed through the formation like a hammer. He fired a burst at the nearest Japanese fighter. Tracer rounds streaked across the sky. The bullet struck the Zero along its fuselage and cockpit. The aircraft rolled violently and began trailing smoke. The Japanese pilot tried to recover. Seconds later, the fighter plunged downward toward the burning airfield below. For confirmed victories now. All in a single morning. But the attack had exposed Welch's position. Several Zero fighters immediately turned to intercept him. They dove after the American aircraft with incredible speed. Machine gun tracers flashed past Welch's canopy. He jerked the control stick left, then right, throwing the fighter into violent evasive maneuvers. The sky had become a chaotic battlefield. Aircraft were diving, climbing, and turning in every direction. Below them, anti-aircraft guns were firing continuously. Black bursts of exploding shells filled the sky. In the middle of this chaos, Kenneth Taylor saw something alarming. One of the Japanese fighters had locked onto his tail. The Zero pilot opened fire. Cannon shells and machine gun rounds ripped toward Taylor's aircraft. Several struck the P-40 almost instantly. Metal fragments exploded across the fuselage. Shrapnel tore through the cockpit. Taylor felt a sharp pain shoot through his arm. Another hit struck his leg. Blood began soaking into his flight suit. But he kept flying. The damaged fighter shook violently as he forced it through a series of sharp turns, trying to shake the Japanese aircraft behind him. The Zero pilot stayed close. Each burst of cannon fire brought more damage. Taylor's aircraft was being torn apart piece by piece. Then George Welch saw what was happening. He immediately broke away from his own engagement. The P-40 dove toward Taylor's pursuer at high speed. The Japanese pilot was completely focused on finishing the wounded American fighter. He never saw Welch approaching from above. Welch lined up the shot carefully. Then he fired. Four machine guns erupted at once. The concentrated burst struck the Zero directly. The Japanese fighter exploded in flames. Pieces of burning wreckage scattered through the air. Taylor had been saved, but his aircraft was badly damaged, and he was bleeding heavily. He turned his fighter toward Wheeler Field, hoping the aircraft would hold together long enough to land. Welch stayed close beside him, watching the sky for any additional attackers. The scene below them was horrifying. Wheeler Field was almost unrecognizable. Hangars were burning. Destroyed aircraft littered the runway. Emergency crews were rushing between wounded soldiers. Despite the chaos, the two fighters managed to land safely. Mechanics immediately ran toward the aircraft. When Taylor climbed out of the cockpit, the ground crew could see the damage clearly. His P-40 looked like it had been shredded. More than a dozen bullet holes covered the fuselage and wings. Taylor himself was barely standing. Blood soaked through the bandages medics quickly wrapped around his wounds. A flight surgeon rushed over and told him he needed to go to the hospital immediately. Taylor refused. He sat on the wing of his battered fighter while the mechanics worked. They patched bullet holes, reloaded ammunition, refueled the aircraft. All around them, fires continued burning across the base. Senior officers were trying to restore order, but communications had been destroyed during the first attack. Nobody knew if more enemy aircraft were still coming. Then the air raid sirens began screaming again. Another formation of Japanese dive bombers had appeared over Wheeler Field. The bombers began their attack runs almost immediately. Behind them, Zero fighters swept low across the airfield, firing at anything that moved. An officer approached Welch and Taylor. He demanded to know who had authorized their flights. Why had they taken off without orders? Who had approved their combat mission? Welch answered calmly. No one had given them orders. They had simply seen the enemy attacking, and they had decided to fight. The officer started to respond. But before he could finish, another explosion shook the airfield. A dive bomber released its payload directly over the base. The bombs detonated nearby. The officer stepped aside. Welch and Taylor ran for their aircraft. Their third combat sortie of the morning was about to begin. And this time, the enemy was directly overhead. The sky above Wheeler Field had turned into chaos. Japanese dive bombers roared overhead while Zero fighters swept low across the airfield, spraying bullets into anything that moved. Explosions shook the ground as bombs struck the already devastated base. George Welch barely had time to climb into his cockpit before another Japanese aircraft screamed across the runway. Ground crews dove for cover as machine gun rounds tore across the airfield. Welch slammed the canopy shut and pushed the throttle forward. The engine of the P-40 Warhawk roared to life. Moments later, the fighter was racing down the damaged runway while enemy aircraft circled directly above him. This takeoff would be the most dangerous one of the entire morning. As Welch's aircraft lifted from the runway, a Japanese dive bomber was pulling up from its bombing run just a few hundred feet ahead. The two aircraft were suddenly climbing toward each other. The Japanese pilot spotted the American fighter too late. Welch opened fire. The machine guns erupted. Tracer rounds slammed into the bomber's engine and fuel tank. The aircraft exploded almost instantly. Burning fragments rained down onto Haleiwa Field below. Mechanics scattered across the runway as pieces of wreckage crashed into the ground. Seconds later, Kenneth Taylor lifted off behind him. Despite his wounds, Taylor had refused to stay on the ground. His damaged aircraft struggled to climb as blood continued soaking through the bandages on his arm and leg. But he was still in the fight. Above them, the sky had become a swirling storm of aircraft. Japanese bombers dove toward their targets while Zero fighters circled like predators, waiting for the American fighters to appear. Anti-aircraft guns fired continuously from the ground. Exploding shells filled the sky with dark clouds of smoke. In the confusion, Welch spotted another opportunity. A Japanese Zero fighter was making a low strafing pass across the Wheeler flight line. The pilot was focused entirely on the ground targets. He never expected an American fighter to appear behind him. Welch dove toward the enemy aircraft. He lined up the shot. Then he pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. His ammunition was gone. After nearly 2 hours of fighting, every round in his machine guns had been fired. Welch pulled away immediately, hoping the Zero pilot had not noticed the silent attack. The Japanese fighter continued its strafing run, completely unaware that it had narrowly escaped destruction. Meanwhile, Kenneth Taylor still had ammunition remaining. Despite his injuries and the heavy damage to his aircraft, he spotted a Japanese dive bomber attempting to withdraw toward the ocean. Taylor pushed his fighter forward in pursuit. The bomber's rear gunner opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit. But Taylor held his position and fired a long burst. The bullet struck the bomber's wing. The metal structure collapsed instantly. The entire wing tore away from the aircraft. The Japanese bomber spiraled downward and crashed into the ocean miles from the coast. It would be one of the final aerial victories of the battle. By now, the Japanese attack was beginning to lose momentum. Fuel levels were dropping. Ammunition supplies were running low. Most importantly, the element of surprise had vanished. The attackers had expected almost no resistance. Instead, small groups of American pilots had managed to reach the sky and fight back. Across the island, scattered American fighters had begun appearing in the battle. The losses among the Japanese aircraft were still relatively small compared to the scale of the attack. But the resistance had complicated their mission. Japanese commanders began issuing orders to withdraw. One by one, the enemy aircraft turned north toward the Pacific Ocean. Far beyond the horizon, their aircraft carriers waited. As the last Japanese fighters disappeared into the distance, the sky over Oahu finally began to grow quiet. The attack was over. Below them, the island burned. George Welch and Kenneth Taylor returned to Haleiwa Field for the final time that morning. Their aircraft were barely flyable. Taylor's P-40 had suffered so much damage that mechanics later declared it beyond repair. Welch's fighter had also taken multiple hits and would require weeks of repairs before it could fly again. When the two pilots climbed from their cockpits, they stood silently for a moment, looking across the destroyed airfield. The base that had been their home just hours earlier had been reduced to wreckage. Hangars had collapsed. Dozens of aircraft were twisted piles of metal. Smoke still drifted across the runway. All around them, emergency crews were searching for survivors. The full scale of the disaster would take days to understand. Across Pearl Harbor and the surrounding bases, more than 2,000 Americans had been killed. battleships had been sunk, airfields destroyed. Entire squadrons of aircraft had been wiped out on the ground. But in the middle of that devastation, something remarkable had happened. Two young pilots had refused to stand down. George Welch had destroyed multiple enemy aircraft. Kenneth Taylor had done the same despite being wounded in combat. Together, they had accounted for a significant portion of the Japanese aircraft losses during the attack. Their actions quickly spread through the military command. Reports of their combat missions reached Washington within days. Military leaders recommended both men for the Medal of Honor, the highest military award in the United States. General Henry Hap Arnold personally approved the recommendation after reading the reports from Hawaii. Two young pilots, barely out of training, had fought against hundreds of enemy aircraft with almost no preparation. But when the recommendation moved up the chain of command, something unexpected happened. An officer reviewing the paperwork raised an objection. The reason was simple. Welch and Taylor had taken off without orders. They had violated military procedure. According to strict interpretation of the regulations, their actions had technically broken the chain of command. The decision shocked many officers who had reviewed the reports. Without their actions, Japanese aircraft might have destroyed even more of the remaining American forces on the island. But the objection remained. The Medal of Honor recommendation was downgraded. Instead, both pilots received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor in the United States Army. The award ceremony took place at the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally presented the medals to the two young pilots. Photographs of the ceremony appeared in newspapers across the country. Overnight, George Welch became one of the most famous fighter pilots in America. But his story did not end at Pearl Harbor. Welch continued flying combat missions throughout the Pacific during the war. He eventually scored 16 aerial victories, becoming a triple-ace fighter pilot. After the war, he became a test pilot and helped develop some of the most advanced jet aircraft of the early Cold War. He flew experimental fighters faster than almost any aircraft before them. Some aviation historians even believe Welch may have broken the sound barrier before the official record was set. But in 1954, during a high-speed test flight of the new F-100 Super Sabre, his aircraft disintegrated during a steep dive. George Welch was killed at the age of 36. Kenneth Taylor survived the war and continued his military career for decades. He eventually retired as a brigadier general after 27 years of service. For the rest of his life, he believed that his friend George Welch deserved the Medal of Honor that had been denied. Today, visitors to Pearl Harbor can still see aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk preserved in museums. They stand as reminders of the morning when the skies over Hawaii burned, and of two young pilots who refused to wait for permission before defending their country. George Welch never received the Medal of Honor. But on December 7, 1941, when the world changed forever, he did something far more important.